Discipline-specific processes. This is an idea that should be really straightforward for you to sort of find some examples from your own academic work. So this is also kind of an easy enough concept to understand, but basically within the academic disciplines, there are specific processes for information creation. And these are, by following these processes, you legitimate the work that you're doing so that people within the discipline will have confidence in it. So they'll say, Brian is a trained historian and he followed, the historical method, and therefore, we'll take his work as a historian within that discipline. So that's really important to understand as a student, that all of the disciplines you're in have discipline-specific processes, and you have to learn these and understand them because it's how the work is legitimated, right, or taken seriously by people in that discipline. Okay, and some of the processes are transferable and they kind of cross disciplines, some less so. Okay, so I'm a historian, and we have the historical method, and part of your training as a historian is learning how to do archival research, and again, the kind of capabilities and constraints of archival research. There's a lot of constraints in terms of archival research. But I have a few other examples just to give you here. So in anthropology, there's ethnography as a form of research, which is when you study a group and you kind of write about the culture of a group. So it could be an ethnography of Dungeons and Dragons players, or it could be an ethnography of estate agents in Ireland, or an ethnography of Wall Street traders, but you're basically studying the culture and norms of a group. And in order to do that, you need to conduct field work. And there's really complicated and methods and ethical issues about conducting field work for anthropologists. So that's highly discipline specific processes involved here. Okay, the sciences, experimental method, and I would also even say kind of discipline specific processes in terms of, kind of understanding the way that scientists talk about replicating experiments and format. Okay, but there's an expectation that all of the astronomers, will talk in such a way and use language and terms in such a way that are specific to the astronomers. They know what they're talking about to each other, make sense to each other. And you could go on and think of some other examples of, discipline-specific processes. At the bottom here, I have quantitative and qualitative, and this is sort of a kind of a separate category. And it's just to show that, within research, we'll talk more about this in research as an inquiry, but there is the division of quantitative and qualitative in terms of analysis. The data which lends itself to statistical analysis, number crunching, or data like interview data, narrative descriptions data, where you are more interested in kind of gleaning meaning from probably smaller sample sizes. So that kind of distinction between quantitative and qualitative also feeds into some discipline-specific processes of information creation. Now, okay. The next point, packaging matters. And I use as my example here, the first example, a peer-reviewed journal. So we've looked at the anatomy, or you probably have encountered it at least, the anatomy of a peer-reviewed journal article, where you have an abstract, an introduction, a method section, results, a discussion. There is particularly in the sciences, a expected format of information presentation. And if you don't present your information, or if you don't go through if you don't present it in the way that it's expected, it will not be taken seriously, and it will kind of stand out. It's sort of like, everybody's saying, A, B, and C, and you come in and kind of say J, P, Z, or something like that. So, there's an expectation in terms of the packaging, right? So, for a peer-reviewed journal, there's an expectation in terms of the references, the formatting, the kind of outline, the whole structure of a peer-reviewed journal article, right? And your work has to be packaged in that manner. But I use the second example will be kind of something like a podcast. And packaging actually matters there in terms of being taken seriously. So if you listen to podcasts, you can kind of look for quality markers. Do they have good lead-in music? Is there good sort of, editing done? Is there nice, maybe some transition music or stuff between sections of a podcast? Does it have a kind of a landing page that's got a, time-stamped table of contents for you to follow? So, all of the kind of expectations around quality relate to a format. So you might think of, different formats of information, and you could kind of rate or come up with a list of sort of what you would expect in terms of markers that indicate high quality. All right. And I have a kind of a bracketed thing here in terms of visual elements. Now, this is not necessarily related to podcast or peer-reviewed journals. This is a separate one, but the visual elements are interesting in terms of good visual elements are a lot of work. And they're not easy to create. And in many cases, readers take them for granted, but when they're bad, they really, really affect the work, and they really, really stand out. So you could take something, for example, like a web page, and you could use, let's say you use a low resolution image file, it looks really bad. So no matter what else is on the web page, people are going to see this very low resolution file, or maybe it's got like, some sort of watermark on it because you lifted it from another website or something like that. It's going to automatically be an indicator of poor quality. Or if we do want to use peer-reviewed journals, you could have a scientific article, and it could be a very important research article, but if the visual elements, the graphs are poorly done, it's going to actually affect the reception of that. So there's lots of ways to think about packaging and why it matters and why it's important. Okay, let's go to the kind of getting towards the end here now. That format does not equal creation process. And so I expand on that by saying the product is not indicative of the process. Okay, so like I said at the beginning of the of the lecture, when you're consuming or looking at that final information product, a book, a journal article, a podcast, a web page, or whatever, it is very tempting to make assumptions about the creation process that went on behind it or resulted in that. But be careful, because that's actually not the case. You need to have a much deeper understanding of the process of information creation, and then you can separate the sort of final product from the creation process. And that's really, really important and one of the kind of fundamental takeaways from this lecture. So I'll give an example here of an 8-page multi-authored peer-reviewed journal article, right? That's what that says. So you might, be assigned a short 8-page journal article, and it's written by 4 people or something like that. And, you read it in a half an hour or something, and you're like, oh, that was a short article. It probably wasn't, a lot of work to put together. Well, the fact that it's multi-authored means there was 4, I say, 4 as a random example. It could have been more. Let's say 4 people involved in the process. That's 4 people working as a group with all of the dynamics that arise from there. There's 4 egos. There's 4 different perspectives on what to include and what not to include. There's a huge amount of work involved in terms of a multi-authored paper, getting everybody to contribute, getting people there on time, understanding how each person contributes their intellectual perspective. So that, on the kind of surface, you might say, looks pretty straightforward, short, simple journal article. But when I look at that and I see multi-authored article, then I automatically know that this is, a process that was really, really complicated. And it may involve each of these individuals conducting specific research tasks and other things like that. So I wouldn't judge, the complexity or the process of the creating this just because it's a short article, and 1 page is visuals and 1 page is notes and there's 6 pages. That doesn't mean that this may have been a very long and painful process. And I mentioned time as a constraint earlier. Depending on the discipline, peer-reviewed journal articles, they take months to write and then months and months before they're published, or even over a year. So that, short multi-authored peer-reviewed article that comes out could have been easily 2 years in the making. Podcasts. So I used podcasts as an earlier example. You might have your favorite podcast. There's a good history podcast, Futility Closet it's called. And podcast is an interesting example in terms of information creation as a process, because it requires very high levels of competencies across areas. So they have to be very good at what they do. In the case of the history podcast, they have to be properly trained and conducting good history and doing good history. But then they also need to be able to present the history, the content, in a way that podcast listeners find engaging, accessible, and enjoyable, right? And that's actually not a straightforward skill. I mean, there's plenty of experts who would struggle. They'd be very happy to present their expertise, their discipline-specific knowledge in an expert context. So a historian talking to historians, a law expert talking just to law experts, right? That's actually the easiest way for an academic to communicate, right? At the high level to the high level, it's actually much harder to translate it into kind of accessibility and also engaging. And then you've got the whole technical competencies that play in terms of, as I mentioned before, editing and things like that. Now, data visualization, the best one, you kind of look at it and immediately get a takeaway from the data visualization. And it could take like a second or two or less. And you look at this data visualization and you immediately get a takeaway. These are actually very, very hard to create. And there's a lot of research into data visualizations in terms of how the human brain works, how the human brain kind of recognizes patterns and sees details. And one of the very interesting things about data visualizations is the idea that there's actually things you could learn faster from a data visualization than you could from perhaps presenting data in a table, or like, an Excel table or something like that. And this is, as I said, kind of cognitive research into sort of how the human brain makes visual sort of acuity works, and we can kind of see stuff and recognize stuff. So, done well, data visualization takes in a whole bunch of different things. So there's, theories about proximity, Gestalt theory, and all sorts of considerations that people who make data visualizations, account for, right? So it's not, it's something that ideally shouldn't give the person looking at it a lot to contemplate other than the information, right? You shouldn't actually be thinking too much about the design. You should be thinking about, what is this showing me? What am I looking at here, right? And it should kind of be fairly obvious, and you kind of can start, making sense of things and exploring things, rather than kind of thinking about, what's the design here? So again, it's not easy to do necessarily. Okay. Last kind of bullet points, and this will be a short one. The information needs and appropriate sources. So this is more of a reminder that, when you have an information need, you need to match a source with the need. So the classic example is an academic paper written for a lecturer. You have an information need, which is high-level academic. Therefore, the appropriate source is going to be high-level academic. All right? When you are making claims, like a statistical claim, right, that again means you have an information need for an appropriate source. In this case, sound statistics that are accepted, so, CSO statistics or ESRI statistics, something like that, right? And in different contexts, different information needs, there might be if you're arguing football in a pub, your information needs and appropriate sources change. Okay, so we'll conclude this lecture for some questions for you. So I'd like you to kind of think about different information products, different sources of information that you consume, Wikipedia, other things like that. What's a constraint of the format, or the genre, if you will, of the information, and what's a capability of that? I'd also like you to reflect on, from your own academic work, some examples of discipline-specific information creation process, right? So describe an example of some discipline-specific information creation processes from your own academic work. And then think of an example where you can disentangle the process from the product. So when you kind of think about when we said that does not equate, think of some examples where, you know, there's a kind of a final product and there's a massive underlying process there. And I mean, I'm just thinking in terms of like politicians in the elections, the amount of focus group work that goes into slogans and things like that. So there's some questions for you to think about and reflect on, but I hope that this lecture has helped you to think a little bit more about the process of information creation.